Okay, good morning everybody. Welcome back. So today we're going to dive into the second part, which is now on international trade, and we're going to start according to the analytical framework that we developed in the last session, which is this framework where we have domestic preferences, domestic institutions, how they influence the policy positions of a country, and then these countries are going to interact on the international level. So we're going to start on the international level now. So we're going to talk about trade cooperation in the international system. We're going to use the theories that we discussed in the first part of the course. We're going to apply them to international trade. We're going to do a very simple game theoretic model, and we're going to find out that we can apply everything that you know about neoliberal institutionalism to international trade. And from this, we can examine the international trading system, especially the GATT system, the World Trade Organization, and what their functions are. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the distributional effects of trade. We're going to compare an economic model, a liberal model of trade, with a more political model of trade, and see how they differ and what this means for the international system. Then we're going to discuss how the GATT system and the World Trade Organization, how they solve the problems that arise from these political models of trade. And then we're going to talk a bit more about one specific feature of the GATT system, or the World Trade Organization, which is the dispute settlement mechanism, because it's one of the core functions of the WTO today. So let's go back to the economics of trade, and you probably know this, or you should know this, from your course on international economics. The models of the economics of trade, they make a strong case in favor of opening up economies for international exchange. And this all goes back so this idea of a comparative advantage goes back to David Ricardo. I mentioned David Ricardo in the second week of the course as one of the most important classical liberal writers, and he made this small model where he says we just have two countries, England and Portugal, and they produce two goods, wine and clothes. And the input costs differ, so he just assumes that the price of a good is equal to the amount of time that you need, or the labor costs that you need to produce the good. So in England, producing wine takes 3 days, and producing clothes, one big piece of cloth, takes 7 days. In Portugal, producing a bottle of wine takes 1 day, and producing clothes takes 5 days. So who's got the advantage in production here? Who do you think? Who's got the absolute advantage, and who's got the comparative advantage? So those are very important distinctions. So Adam Smith mostly talked about absolute advantages. Who's got the absolute advantage of producing what? Yeah. Portugal has an absolute advantage in producing wine and clothes. So Portugal has an absolute advantage in both. What about the comparative advantage? Yeah. England has a comparative advantage in producing clothes. So relative to the labor cost of producing wine, clothes can be produced more cheaply. But Portugal has a comparative advantage in producing wine. Relative to clothes, wine can be produced cheaply. So that's the important point. Everybody, even if a country has an absolute advantage in producing both, or an absolute disadvantage in producing both, it still has a comparative advantage in producing at least one of those goods. So now we want to exchange these goods, right? So we assume we don't have any money here. So if you produce one piece of clothes, one bolt of clothes, that takes 5 times in Portugal the time of producing a bottle of wine. So for one bolt of clothes, you could buy 5 bottles of wine, right? In Portugal. But in England, it's different. So it takes 7/3 of the time to produce a bottle of clothes relative to produce a bottle of wine. So these are the prices. So for 1 bolt of clothes in England, you get 2 1/3 bottles of wine. And for 1 bolt of clothes, you get 5 bottles of wine in Portugal, right? And here you can already see the benefits from exchange. So suppose you're a British clothes producer, right? And you have 1 bolt of clothes. You can buy 2 1/3 of a bottle of wine in England. Or you go to Portugal and you get 5. That's way better, right? Or suppose you want to buy, you're a wine producer and you a Portuguese wine producer, and you want to buy 1 bolt of clothes. How much do you have to pay? How many bottles do you have to pay in Portugal? Well, you need 5 to buy 1 bolt of clothes, right? But if you go to England, you just need 2 1/3 of the bottle of 2 1/3 of a bottle to buy the same amount of clothes, right? So you're way better off buying your clothes in England. So these are the gains from exchange. So for 1 bolt, clothes producers can buy 2 1/3 bottles in England or 5 bottles in Portugal. Of course, they go to Portugal. And for 5 bottles of wine, wine producers can buy either 1 bolt of clothes in Portugal or more than 2 in England, right? And that's the gains from exchange. So we're both better off. The Portuguese are better off by buying their clothes in England, and the English are better off buying their wine in Portugal. And the important point here is that both countries benefit from trade. It's not just Portugal who has an absolute advantage in producing both, but also the English producers benefit from international exchange. That's the key point here. So this is just a simple version of what you learn in international economics, right? And that's a classic example by Ricardo. I have here the link on the WTO website, which, let me just, so you can click on this on the slide, and you get to the website of the WTO, and they explain this to you again if you want. So you can do this for yourself at home. So that's the economic story. What's the problem? So we already did 3 weeks of IPE, and we discussed the evolution of the international trading system. So if you hear this story, what should you ask yourself? What's the implication of this? There shouldn't be no political discussion about having tariffs because everybody's going to be better off, right? But that's not the case, as we've discussed in week 1 and later. So the trade system has repeatedly collapsed during its history. And we talked about the Smoot-Hawley tariff. In the interwar period, we talked about imperial preference system imposed by Britain in the 1930s in the interwar period. So this should not happen if everybody is happy about trade. If we have a closed system, trade liberalization is very difficult to achieve. And an example, we again discussed many examples. One is the repeal of the Corn Laws. Remember, the Corn Laws were imposed in 1815 in Britain after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and it took until 1848 to repeal them. So the question is, why is free trade so difficult to achieve if the economic model is right and everybody benefits, right? And you won't be surprised to hear that the answer is politics. So let's get through this. Let's work through this. So let's again start to see what we need to change from the economic model by starting again from the liberal model of trade. Now we're going to construct a very simple game theoretic model that reflects the economic situation, the situation described by the economic models. Or it represents basically a liberal view on international trade, a classic liberal view as we discussed it in the second week by Ricardo, Adam Smith, and so on. So suppose we have two countries and they have two options. Each country can either protect or liberalize. Liberalize means we abolish tariffs and we have free trade. And by a liberal story, the government should value trade really highly because it brings us welfare gains because citizens can consume more, right? So if you live with this mindset, what would be the best outcome? So we might now make a preference order. What would be the best outcome? What's your most preferred outcome as a government? So a combination of choices between your policy and the other country's policy. What would you like most? Yes? Both liberalize, exactly. That's the best outcome. What's the second best option? Yes? So the other country liberalizes and I stay closed, which means we are already in a slightly mercantilist mindset. I care about my jobs, right? That's probably what you have in mind. But that means I can consume less. So it's actually not entirely clear what the second best option is. So what I said here is that I protect and the other one liberalizes equal to liberalization by me and protectionism by the other. So here I protect my jobs, here I can consume more, right? We don't know. It doesn't matter. And the worst option is a closed economy, right? That's pretty clear. Now if we put all this into a payoff matrix, into a game, we get this. This is the payoff matrix of this game. Can you see what the Nash equilibrium is? Any guesses? So you can solve it at home. I'm just going to tell you. The Nash equilibrium is here. Both are going to liberalize. Nobody's going to be better off by moving anywhere else, right? You can see that. If country B starts to protect, impose trade barriers, it's going to get less. The same for country A. If country A moves here, it's going to protect, it's going to get less, right? So nobody's going to go away and impose tariffs. And this game is called harmony. The implication is that the prediction of this game is that governments engage in free trade because it's the best outcome that they can produce. And this is actually Pareto optimal. Nobody can be better off by moving somewhere else. So there's an assumption in here, and you already hinted at that. What is the assumption? To make this work, what is the assumption? Yes? So, yes, from certain parts of the population. So it's detached from, it doesn't listen to those who lose their jobs, right? That's the thing. It does listen to consumers. A consumer is also a voter. So consumers benefit from this. So it's not detached from consumers, but it doesn't care about jobs. It just cares about consumption. That's the assumption here. So the point here is that what Ricardo describes here produces winners and losers, and he doesn't talk about that much. So who is the winner? Who is the winners here? So there's consumers are the winners of this, but who else is a winner? Yeah. Yes, so I'm going to talk about this in a moment. Yeah, so exactly. So Who is the winner? Consumers and? Exactly. So in England, the cloth producers are the winners. In Portugal, the wine producers are the winners, right? But there's losers, which is, in England, the wine producers are the losers, and in Portugal, the cloth producers are the losers, right? And that's important. So now, so the winners are the winners from protectionism. So suppose we demand a trade barrier and the government responds and imposes tariffs, then the winner is import competing producers and potentially the government. Why the government? What does the government win from a tariff? It's basically a tax, so it wins income, right? So who are the losers from protectionism? Well, consumers. Then we might have non-tradable producers, so the domestic service industry, the construction industry, the public sector. To the extent that they rely on foreign inputs, they lose because these foreign inputs become more expensive. And the export-oriented firms might lose if the other country responds and also imposes a trade barrier, right? So now let's do a slightly more political game that takes into account these distributional conflicts. We have the same model, two countries, two options, country A and B. They can liberalize in protection or impose a protectionist measure. But now the government puts significant weight on employment in those sectors that are not competitive. So the Portuguese government cares about cloth producers and their employees, and the English government cares about wine producers. So what's now the preference order? One potential preference order. What's the best outcome? What would you as a government do? Yes? Exactly. So now I try to protect and you liberalize, so I can actually export to your country, and I don't get your imports, which hurts consumers, but it benefits my import competing sector. Exactly. What's the second best option? Yes? We both liberalize, so which means I can still export to your country and I benefit from low consumer prices. The third best option? We both protect, because that means, and the worst option is that I liberalize, I lose the jobs, and you're protectionist, right? So now we again going to put this into a payoff matrix, and we get this. Have you seen this game before? So which game is it? Yes? So this is the prisoner's dilemma. The Nash equilibrium is that both are going to protect. So governments are, in this model, if there's nothing that helps them to change their mind, governments are by default protectionist. But free trade would make us better off. That's the point. So here we get 1-1, but if we both liberalize, we would be better off, both, right? So we can use this simple game theoretic structure to understand what's going on in this in trade politics. And clearly, this model seems to explain government motivations better than the purely economic model, right? Because we often see how the governments are by default protectionist, and it takes them a lot to decrease trade barriers and trade. Good. Any questions about this? So now, the idea is that we are in this protectionist equilibrium, and we want to move to the free trade situation because we're going to be both better off, right? What's the solution? What does international relations theory tell you what the solution is? Well, the solution is international institutions. So certain strategies, we know that certain strategies help us to overcome this cooperation problem. The first one is a repeated play. To move from the non-cooperative equilibrium in the prisoner's dilemma to the cooperative situation where we both trade, we need repeated play. We need to play this game again and again and again. That's the first solution. The second requirement is that we need a long time horizon. We need to care about the future sufficiently much to actually outweigh the benefits from short-term defection. This is called the shadow of the future. And the strategy that helps us to do this, to overcome the cooperation problem, is reciprocity, because it raises the cost of defections. So to achieve this, what we need is regular interactions. We need to tie countries together to make sure that they really understand and see how that they're going to interact for a long time in the future, forever, potentially. We need clear rules what appropriate behavior is and what a defection is. So we need to define what is P and what is L, right? We need rules that define whether country actually defected or cooperated. And once we know that, we also need to provide information to everybody whether the country is actually following the rule or whether they are defecting. It's often very tricky to find out. So if we have 200 countries, it's very difficult to monitor everybody in each trade, in each sector, whether they impose the secret trade barrier and so on. So we need an institution that does all that. So if you can go back to the lecture last week where we discussed this already, right? And as it turns out, the GATT and the World Trade Organization do exactly this. So the GATT has certain characteristics. First, it is multilateral. And so you have a global membership, and this membership is permanent, which means you promote repeated interactions. You extend the time horizon of governments when they think about trade, because you're not going to just interact once in this one-time international economic, in this trade exchange, but potentially you're going to do this forever into the future, right? That's the idea. And this the multilateral structure and the global membership means that we have really diverse interests. So some country cares about trade in cars, another country cares about trade in chemical products, and so on. So that allows for issue linkage, right? Issue linkage is one way to overcome cooperation problems. The second feature of the system is the decision-making procedure. And it's characterized by decision-making by consensus. So first, that means that each country has one vote. That's not the case in all organizations. So in the IMF, for instance, we have weighted voting. Bigger countries have more votes than small countries. This is not the case in the World Trade Organization. On top of that, every country needs to agree to the rules, which means we need a consensus. So de facto, everybody has a veto power. And the idea is that this should induce broad compliance with the trading rules. If we all agree, it's easier to agree than if some other countries impose these rules on us. We have very detailed regulations on tariffs, non-traded barriers, intellectual property rights. So these are those rules that we need to set the standards of appropriate behavior and clarify what is a defection and what is a cooperative act. And then we need information about what countries really do. And that's this, what's called a trade policy review. every few years, a country is being reviewed by the World Trade Organization and its members, and information is provided whether states actually comply with the rules or whether they don't. And then the dispute settlement body serves as a sanctioning mechanism or a political enforcement mechanism that starts to operate when the countries actually are not going to comply. So let's quickly talk about the rules. I touched upon them already a few weeks ago. So we've got, in principle, these rules are based on certain norms. So there's a deeper norm that is embodied by these institutions, the GATT system and the World Trade Organization. The first norm is clearly that market liberalism is a good thing. And that all goes back to classical liberalism, Adam Smith and Ricardo, and the economics of trade, which I just reviewed, saying that everybody benefits from trade. And therefore, we do not discriminate against countries. We have a system that's open to trade, and we are totally transparent in what we do. And these norms are then reflected or practically implemented in specific rules. I already mentioned the most favored nations rule. What does the most favored nations rule say? It says that you need to treat all the other WTO members as good as your most favored trading partner, the trading partner to which you apply the lowest level of tariff, right? So let's take an example. So let's say Britain and Germany are WTO members, and Ireland is not. And Ireland has a tariff on products from Britain, which is just 5%, but a tariff on products from Germany, which is 10%, because it traditionally had good trading relations with Britain. So if Ireland enters the WTO, it needs to lower the tariff towards Germany to the level of tariffs towards Britain. So the tariff towards Germany, to imports from Germany, decreased from 10 to 5%. So just by one entry, the tariff level decreases massively, because it needs to do that vis-a-vis all the other WTO member countries. So this most favored nations rule is specified in several treaties. So we have the WTO is based on a series of treaties. The first one is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It's in Article 2 on the General Agreement on Trade in Services, which is the GATS, and it's in Article 4 of the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights treaty. Then we've got the National Treatment Rule, which basically means that you don't apply different technical standards to producers from abroad than you do to producers from a home. You have the dispute settlement mechanism, and you have the trade policy review. So these articles, by the way, refer to the Uruguay Round Agreement, which is called GATT 1994. That's going to be important in a moment. There is the GATT 1947, which is the GATT system that was established in the 1940s. But that's not in operation anymore. It's now the GATT 1994. That seems like a legal distinction, but it's actually very important in a moment. So these are just the two rules. Let me quickly talk about how the WTO looks like in practice. So we've got the Ministerial Conference, which is the highest authority. It meets about every 2 years, and that's where we decide on trade agreements. As I said, there's equal voting power, one country, one vote. There's selected majority voting in certain areas. So if we need to interpret an agreement, if we disagree, we need a 3/4 majority. If the WTO can waive obligations to certain member countries, so if a country is in deep economic trouble, we might accept that they don't follow the rules for a while. That also needs a 3/4 majority. Admissions need a 2/3 majority, and so on. And then the daily business is done by the General Council, which is operating on behalf of the Ministerial Conference. And sometimes it meets as the dispute settlement body, and sometimes it meets as the trade policy review body. So as the dispute settlement body, it just oversees and adopts the rulings by the panel, which is basically an international court that rules over the trade policy of certain of countries. I'm going to talk about this in the second half today. I just want to quickly tell you what the trade policy review body does. And the trade policy review body regularly reviews the policies of the WTO member states. So the 4 biggest trading countries, so that's the EU, the US, Japan, and China. The EU acts as one country in the WTO. They're going to be reviewed every second year. So what they do is they submit a report on their trade policy. Then staff, bureaucrats in the WTO, they also write a report on the trade policy of this country. Then this report is going to be issued to everybody. Then it's going to be discussed publicly in a forum, and then they will just issue a final report. So the point is that this body does not sanction anybody. It's just about discussing whether a country's trade policy is consistent or in violation with WTO rules. That's already very important. According to neoliberal institutionalism, information is one of the key issues to induce cooperation, right? So that's what this body does, what this part of this institution does. It just provides information, and that already helps to make cooperation more likely. So the next 16 countries are reviewed every 4 years, and then the remaining countries are reviewed every 6 years. So that all sounds pretty nice. Now the question is, to what extent does power still play into this institution, right, or into this organization? We have one country, one vote, we have consensus. This sounds like a pretty good thing. Because it supposedly eliminates the role of power in this international trading system. Now it turns out that's not the case. So let's look at how this works. How does power enter the WTO? And that's what this paper by Steinberg from 2002 does. So he says there's bargaining in the shadow of law, which means everybody's being treated equal because we have this idea of sovereign equality, and it's specified in Article 9 of the GATT agreement. But we also have, as we're going to see, we have bargaining in the shadow of power. So power still matters. So what we see is that we need to divide negotiations in the World Trade Organization into different phases. So we have the launch phase of a negotiation round, right? So the last negotiation round that was concluded was the Uruguay round. It was concluded in the early 90s. And such a round, I think there were 9 rounds until today, and such a round starts with the launch phase where we discuss what do we want to talk about in the first place. Then we have a bargaining phase, and then we have the closure phase, which is when we actually conclude and find and decide on a final agreement. So in the launch phase, it's all very cooperative. So we specify the topics that are being covered, and what's usually being done is we decide that things that are in the interest of everybody are going to be discussed. An example is the launch of the Kennedy round in 1963, where the US, which was the most important player at the time, explicitly acknowledged the interest of the least developing countries, the LDCs, and says, yes, we should also talk about agriculture, because that was mostly, that was a big concern for, that's already still very much excluded from the WTO rules, and it's of great interest to developing countries. So this is bargaining in the shadow of law, because we treat everybody the same, equal, and we try to find an agreement that's Pareto optimal that makes everybody better off. But then this changes later in the bargaining procedure. So where does relative power come from? Relative power comes from relative market size, because it affects the so-called BATNA. BATNA is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So it basically means, what is the cost for you if you don't get this agreement, right? And the cost is greater the poorer and the smaller you are. You can apply the same concept is always applied to an international negotiations. You can apply it to the Brexit. So who's got the better BATNA? The EU or Britain by this idea? Well, Britain is relatively worse off if it doesn't get a deal with the EU than the EU. Because the EU already has a big market, EU countries can trade among themselves, and Britain suffers more if it's excluded from the EU market than the EU countries if they are excluded from the British market. That's the idea here. And the same applies to the WTO. And power is mostly evident in the closure phase of such a trade agreement. And it works in two ways. The first is there's informal agenda setting power. So in principle, everybody can make a proposal what should become WTO law. But then once this is being negotiated, the WTO members are being split up into smaller groups, the so-called green room, where you discuss these proposals in smaller groups, 20 to 30 member states, and who's always in the room are the big players, the EU and the US and Japan, but it's not always all the developing countries who are in the room. So what happens is the proposals by developing countries, they are said to have a habit of dying. They just disappear. And those that are being left, those that are left usually come from Brussels or from Washington. That's the first thing. Now, the developing countries, of course, could object and say, well, if all our proposals disappear and only your proposals survive, we're just not going to agree. Well, that's what they do. But then the big players can, or sometimes do, coerce and force the small players into these agreements. And an example here is exactly the Uruguay round. Now, this distinction between GATT 1994 and GATT 1947 becomes important. What happened was that the developing countries were not happy about these agreements on trade in services and intellectual property rights. So they threatened not to agree to this agreement. And what the EU and the US then did is they said, well, look, we're just going to do a new agreement. We're going to do GATT 1994, which is a whole new agreement, which is independent of the old GATT agreement. So we're going to sign this GATT agreement. We're going to enter that. And after we enter it, we're going to leave the old one. We're going to withdraw from GATT 1947. And if you want to enter GATT 1994, it's a single undertaking, which means you either take it all or you leave it all, right? You can either accept all these agreements, the TRIPS, the GATTs, and the GATT 1994, or you get nothing. So, and that's what they did. So the big countries, they left the GATT 1947 and entered the GATT 1994, which means that all the others did the same, right? The developing countries did the same. So they replaced the old GATT system with a legally different new GATT system. Parts of it are the same, but it's legally distinct. That's the important thing. So they coerced the developing countries into this new system. We saw a similar movement in an earlier negotiation round So this was the Tokyo round, which was happening in the 70s during the Cold War. And again, we had this idea, so the developing countries were threatening not to accept the deal. And then in the United States had this idea to replace this old GATT with what they back then called the GATT Plus. So exactly the same idea like replacing the GATT 47 with the GATT 94. But eventually they decided not to do this because they feared that the developing countries would be attracted more by the Soviet Union at the time. So the geopolitics, or the Cold War in the 1970s, prevented this replacement of the old GATT with a new GATT. There was less coercion. And in 1993, the Cold War ended, so there was no fear that they would move away from the Western world towards the Soviet Union. So they just used coercion much more explicitly and much more strongly than in the 1970s. Do you have any questions about this? Good. So let's take the break, and then we're going to talk about how this actually affects trade and how the dispute settlement mechanism works. Okay, welcome back. Hello. So, just to recapitulate, what this all means is that, yes, formally the WTO and the GATT system is a system with equal, that relies on the idea of equal member states, but the way inequality is generated is not by the voting rules, like it is the case in the IMF, for instance, or other organizations, but it's by how the rules are designed. They are designed in a way that that are potentially more beneficial to the large states than the small and less powerful states. The second question that arises is, does it actually matter? Does the GATT have an effect? So if we go back to our idea of the prisoner's dilemma, does it actually, what it means is that if we are in a non-GATT world, in a world without the international trading system, or the international institutionalized these trading rules, then we should see less trade than with the GATT. So what this speaks to more broadly is the question that's really central in international relations. This question is, do international institutions matter, right? So it speaks to the debate between realists and liberals. The realists say, no, they don't matter. They just reproduce what we would have seen anyway. They reproduce the interest of the hegemonic state, and the hegemonic state would have achieved the same result in other ways without institutions. It just facilitates what the hegemon wants. And the liberals say, no, actually institutions matter. They produce a fundamentally different result that would not have occurred without this institution. And applied to trade, the question then breaks down to the question, how does the GATT and the WTO system affect trade? Does it increase trade or does it not increase trade? How could we examine this? Well, what we can do is we just collect trade data for all country pairs, right? We collect data on trade from Switzerland to Germany in 1950, Switzerland to Germany in 1951, Switzerland to Germany in 1952, and then from Germany to Switzerland in 1950, 51, 52, and so on. And we do this for all country pairs, right? Those are directed dyad. A dyad is a country pair, and directed means that we don't just look at the country pair, but we look at the direction of trade from Switzerland to Germany or the other way around. And we look at this from 1946 to 2004. So this is what this paper by Goldstein and Corthers does. And then they estimate a model which is actually not as complex as it looks. So we take logs, ignore the logs, that's just to make the model linear. But what M is, it's import from country A, I, to country J in time t. So I, for instance, is Switzerland, and J is Germany, and T is 1950. So this is the amount of imports from Switzerland to Germany in 1950, right? And this is a function of so that's the dependent variable. And that's a function that can be explained by a range of independent variables. For instance, what we are interested in, whether the countries I, J in time t are members of the GATT system or not, right? And this coefficient beta 1 tells us the direction of this influence. So if GATT membership is 0 and if no GATT membership is 0 and GATT membership is 1, what should we expect in terms of beta 1? So beta 1 tells us how being a member of the GATT system affects imports from one country to another. So the effect should be positive, right? If the GATT variable flips from 0 to 1, if it increases, trade also increases. So that's what we're interested in. Now, trade also is a function of other factors, like the size of the country, so it's just the product of the GDPs, and the distance between countries. So countries that are closer, they trade more than countries that are more distant. So that's a model that we're going to estimate. I want to show you how this looks like. This is something, so what I'm going to show you now, that caused confusion last year. It's not, you don't need this for the exam. I just want to give you a sense how this works, right? So this is a statistics program, and this is the data, right? So you have, as I said, in this row, you have Switzerland, and the second country is Afghanistan in 1956, and imports are about 13 millions, right? And then this is the same in 1957, in 1958, in 1959, and so on. And we've got this for all the countries for which you can get data. So let's take Switzerland. So this is Switzerland. Switzerland, Czech Republic, Switzerland, and Denmark from 1950, 46, 47. And again, the numbers. And what we have here is whether country 1, in this case Switzerland, is a GATT member, and whether country 2, in this case Denmark, is a GATT member as well. So here in 1946, Switzerland was not a GATT member, and it provisionally entered in 1960, and it entered under Article 33 in 1966. And Denmark here entered earlier. It entered in 1950 already, right? So we've got all this data, and and we have more than 300,000 such country pairs, right? And what we're now going to do is, it's not us, but what they did is they estimated using this data this coefficient, beta 1. And we think it should be positive. And this is the first result. It's very small. I'm going to tell you what it means. So what we find is that this beta 1 is minus 0.7. So it's negative, and it's very small, right? So that's not what we would have expected. It basically means that the GATT has either a negative effect or no effect, right, on trade, which is puzzling. And they did this. This was a finding by an economist, Andrew Rose, who said in the early 2000s, who said, like, look, I tried to see what the effect of the GATT is on trade, and I found that it's 0 or even negative. So that's the starting point of this study by Goldstein. And they say, well, you made a mistake. What you have is you cannot just look at formal membership, because some countries follow the rules of the GATT without being a formal member. So if countries think about joining the WTO or the GATT system back then, they already apply the rules before they actually become a formal member, right? And they call this a non-member participant. Or, for instance, the former colonies of Great Britain, they had some, after they became independent, they had some time until they could choose whether they actually want to become part of the GATT or not. And during this time, the rules they already enjoyed the benefits of the GATT system. So they were non-member participants. And this previous studies doesn't distinguish between non-member participants and non-members, right? So what they say is we need to look at different types of country pairs. Formal members and formal members, where one country is a formal member and the other one is a non-member participant. And when we have two non-member participants. And in all three cases, they are de facto following the GATT rules. So we need to code them as a 1, basically. They are de facto GATT members, right? And then we have country pairs where we have only one participant. So we have a formal member and a non-participant, a non-member participant and a non-participant. And the excluded category is where we have two non-participants. So what we want to see is, does trade between two formal members increase relative to those two countries that are non-members, right? That's our reference category. That's what we want to find out. So what they do is they revise the model. They have the same dependent variable, which is trade from one country to another. But they now split up this GATT variable into 5 variables. So we have 2 formal members, 2 non-member participants, 1 formal member and 1 non-member participant, a formal member and a non-participant, a non-member participant and a non-participant. So we have 5 variables. And we expect that the coefficient, so this beta 1 here, the first beta 1, is positive, this should be positive, this should be positive, this should be positive, and this should be positive. But this one potentially is the largest one. So they do the same thing again. They estimate this model, and this is what we find. So you see we now have a coefficient on both formal members, which is 0.34. So this 0.34 is basically this beta 1, 1, right? That's the number we get for here. So trade equals 0.34 times whether a member is a participant or not, whether both members are participants or not, right? So it's positive and it's large. It confirms that the GATT has a strong effect on trade. The second, the 0.45, is the coefficient that we have here, beta 1, 2. So non-member participant, non-member participant. That's what you see here, both non-member participants. The 0.38, that's a coefficient beta 1, 3, a formal member and a non-member participant, right? And even among those countries where we only have 1 participant, a formal member or a non-member participant, we have a positive coefficient, but it's smaller than for the others. So bottom line here is, if both countries participate, either as formal members or as non-member participants, then we see a strong effect on trade, positive effect on trade. If only 1 country participates, either as a formal member or as a non-member participant, and the other country does not participate, we still see a positive effect, but it's smaller. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So the conclusion is, from this, yes, the GATT, if we measure GATT membership correctly, GATT membership has a strong effect on trade. So the institution is pretty effective. That's what you take away from this. So we're going to talk more about this in the complement étude, in the tutorial. So we have the key dependent variable here is trade, and the key independent variable here is GATT membership, and different forms of GATT membership. Do you have any questions about this? Actually, you're gonna, I think most of you, if you're in the 3rd year, you're taking the méthode appliquée, I think you call it MADI, right? So you learn exactly these things, right? So that's how these courses are linked. What you do in MADI is actually useful. You can actually study whether the World Trade Organization is effective or not. You can do all these things. Good. What you could actually do is you could the data that I just showed you from this paper. You can find it on the web, or I can actually put it on Camilo, and then you can replicate these results if you want. So just one last thing on this study. What they also do is they compare the effect of the GATT membership and other potential drivers of trade and their effect over time. So you see this line here tells you the effect of GATT membership on trade between 2 countries from 1947 until 2004. And what you see is that at the beginning, being a GATT member in 1947 almost doubled the amount of trade that you had compared to countries that were not GATT members. But this effect then declines. It's actually only 50% and a 50% increase in trade in the 1960s, and then it's actually very minor from 1980 onwards. So the effect of GATT is really large at the beginning and becomes smaller and smaller over time. That's pretty intuitive because we resolved many of the sort of tariffs within the GATT system declined most in the early period of the GATT system, and now it's mostly about smaller obstacles to trade. Now there's other variables. So whether you're a colony of a country explains trade a lot. If you're a former colony of Britain, this massively increases the trade with Britain, but again, this effect declines sharply later. This dashed line here, that's PTAs, that's preferential trade agreements. Preferential trade agreements really literally exploded in the 1990s. They are now the most important drivers of trade, as you can see here. So the effect of preferential trade agreements on trade constantly increases. So the biggest driver of trade today is not the GATT system, but it's bilateral or trilateral trade agreements. So preferential trade is the most important aspect of trade these days. And that's why we're going to discuss them in 2 weeks. We have an extra session on trade agreements. So the substantive effect of the GATT is significant. Its effect declines over time. And the effect is consistent with the evolution of the multilateral trading system and the rise of preferential trade agreements. So this is the effect of the GATT in general. So let's look at the function, how the GATT or the World Trade Organization functions and how it actually produces these effects. And one important procedure is the so-called WTO dispute settlement mechanism. And how it works is that, suppose we have 2 countries. We have the EU and the United States. And the EU or the United States is unhappy about a trade barrier that the EU imposed on imports from the United States. One example would be the subsidies that the EU countries are paying to Boeing. I think I mentioned those in the second week. And that disadvantages Boeing, for instance, which is an American plane producer. So what they do is they need to request consultations, which means that the US says, well, we've got a problem, we need to talk. Let's meet in Geneva, and then they try to solve this problem in consultations bilaterally. If that happens, if they solve the problem, and the complainant, which is the United States, is satisfied with the solution, then the dispute ends. But often that's not the case. So the EU resists, says, no, we're not going to change anything. Then what the United States can do is it can request a panel. Panel is established. And the panel is a commission of 3 experts, 3 independent experts, trade lawyers. And they're going to act like a court. So there's then the panel examination, 2 meetings with the parties, 1 meeting with third parties. Third parties are parties that are not complaining, but they observe, have an interest in the dispute. And then eventually, there's a panel report, which is a ruling. The panel rules and says, well, the EU is wrong, it has to change its policy. And then the dispute settlement body, all the countries adopt this body, this report. Then the EU can appeal, then there will be another round, and then there will be, that's called the appellate review, and then there will be a final report. Now the EU has to change the policy. So this is the implementation phase. There is the report by the losing party of proposed implementation within a reasonable period of time. So the EU now needs to report what it does to change its behavior. In case often then these countries do implement what's being requested, but sometimes they don't. So the EU still is paying subsidies to Airbus. So in cases of non-implementation, there can be a dispute over implementation, and we're going to do the whole thing again. Now we're going to have a dispute whether I actually follow the verdict of the panel or not. And if I then still do not, if the EU still does not comply, then we have the EU authorizes the US to retaliate. So now it authorizes the United States to impose counter tariffs on imports from the EU. That's how it works. And again, the idea here is that this should reduce the role of power in the international system, because it's a highly legalized system where we all are being treated as equal. Every country can file a dispute against the United States and get a verdict, for instance, or against the EU, or against Japan. So here's an example. When you go to the WTO websites, you find very detailed descriptions on these cases. So this is just one, but on all the cases, there's about 500 disputes, and you find detailed descriptions of all of this. And what you see here is that, so this is a dispute between Brazil and the United States on cotton subsidies. The US is paying a lot of subsidies to its cotton producers. What's the problem? Why does anybody care? Exactly, so it's unfair to other countries who don't pay subsidies. I mean, they could do the same, but then it doesn't help, right? The problem is here that the world price for cotton is being depressed. It's lower than it should be because the US is such a big producer of cotton, and that's subsidized, right? And that's a big problem for Brazil, who's also a cotton producer, but it's also a problem for small countries like Chad and Mali and Burkina Faso, who could actually produce cotton competitively at the market price, but they can't produce cotton competitively at a price that is being depressed because of cotton subsidies, right? That's the problem here. So the complainant is Brazil, the respondent is the United States, and Brazil requested consultations in September 2002. Then there was a panel proceeding, there was a panel report in 2004, there's an appellate review and body report in 2005, then Article 21.5 panel report, that's the implementation dispute. The US did not implement the verdict, so there was not this other dispute. So we had, that report was finished in 2007. There was an appeal by the US. Then the report was the verdict was in 2008. And then eventually the WTO allowed Brazil to take countermeasures and impose tariffs on goods from the United States to punish the United States. And then the US government changed or responded. Now what they did is they started to compensate Brazilian cotton producers. So they're paying direct money to Brazilian cotton producers, right, to compensate them. And that solves the dispute. However, there's many other interested parties, right? So Argentina, Benin, Chad, they don't get anything from that, right? So only Brazil benefits in this case. So it looks like a good thing, and it certainly is a good thing, but the mechanics behind this makes it a bit more complicated, right? So it helped Brazil, it didn't help Chad so much. So this is just one example. As I said, there's many others, there's 500 of them. You might have heard of the banana dispute when the EU did not impose tariffs on imports of bananas from South America and favored banana producers from Africa, because the African banana producers were the French firms and the South American banana producers were the American firms. So it goes all ways. Those are the big disputes. There's smaller disputes as well, which are much less politicized and about much more technical issues. So there's a few concerns here. So there's different views in international relations what such an international court does. And the legal rule is, the legal view, which comes from international law, is that these dispute mechanisms are mostly about rule clarifications. When we write these rules, it's actually not clear. We need to interpret them later on, right? We can disagree on what they mean. In that case, it simply means we need this dispute settlement mechanism just to clarify the rules, and then we move on. That's certainly the case in some instances. But often it's actually much more political, as I just showed you in the cotton case. It's about we want to identify defections. We want to find out who's a violator of the rule, and then we want to implement reciprocity. So what the authorization of retaliation by the WTO panel for Brazil, that's nothing else than tit for tat, right? So it's a practical application of the idea of tit for tat and reciprocity in international relations theory to trade relations. But the problem now is that this tit for tat only works among the big countries, right? What's the purpose of Chad? What's the possibility of Chad to retaliate against the US? I mean, it's impossible, right? So that has raised a lot of concerns that the WTO remains a court with no bailiff, with no power. That means that its rulings can at best have a modest effect on dispute outcomes. And there's a second problem which is related, is that we have a participation bias. So not all countries participate equally in this system. So this is the numbers. So this is which type of countries, industrialized countries, developing countries, and least developing countries, how often they have participated in the dispute settlement mechanism. And the light gray is whether they participated as a complainant, and the dark gray is whether they participated as a defendant. And what we see is that in more than 60, often 70% of the cases, the dispute settlement mechanism is being used by the rich countries. And in a bit more than 40% of the cases, it's being used by the developing countries, and almost never it's being used by the least developing countries. So what does that mean? How can we explain that? How can we explain why this happens? What would be the mechanisms behind that? Do you have an idea? Well, I hinted at one already. That's the first. The Chad doesn't think it's even useful because it's not going to help them anyway. They cannot retaliate, so the US anticipates that, so the US is not going to respond, so it's a waste of money, right? That's the first thing. What else could be a problem? Well, the second one is the big countries actually deter the small countries. They say, well, if you do that, I'm gonna cut foreign aid, for instance. If you go to the WTO, I'm gonna retaliate with a dispute in another sector. So power asymmetries could potentially be important. Power asymmetries could explain this participation bias. Another one is legal capacity. That's been discussed a lot. Such a trade dispute is fairly expensive. You need to hire trade lawyers, and they are not cheap. You need to hire them for multiple years. You need to hire people who collect evidence that the other country is violating the rules. And then you need to do the trial here in Geneva. As you've seen, the cotton case started in 2002, and it ended in 2009. So you need to pay trade lawyers for 7 years, which is not cheap if you're a very poor country. Then it's a highly legalized systems, and these very poor countries often don't have experience with using these systems, while Switzerland or Germany, I mean, this system basically just reflects how the system in Germany or Switzerland works, the legal system works, right? It's exactly the same logic. So this could be evidence for discrimination within the dispute settlement body. Could it also be the result of something else, something that's less discriminatory? What else could explain this? Is it just power? Is it just capacity? What could be another reason why the rich and big countries are more involved in disputes than the poor countries and the small countries? So they have more interest in trade, so they trade more. If you trade more, it's more likely that you encounter a trade barrier that's inconsistent with WTO law. So simply the size of the country and the amount of trade that they have could lead to this outcome without any bias and any power problem, right? That could be an explanation. So we have two competing explanations. That's something that I analyzed in a previous paper. We can have, it could be what we can call gravitation result, that trade and market size explain this simply because bigger countries trade more. Or it could be discrimination because power and legal capacity matter. Now, how could we test that? We do it exactly, or pretty in a similar way as Goldstein tested the effectiveness of the GATT. We collect data on a dependent variable, which is the number of disputes within the WTO. So how often did Switzerland file a dispute against the United States? And how often did Afghanistan file a dispute against Switzerland? Right? And we collect data on this for all the countries. So that's a dependent variable. The number of disputes in a direct WTO dyad between 1995 and 2003. And we explain this with bilateral trade and the size of the countries. So bilateral trade and GDP of the two countries, that basically reflects the independent variables that are related to the gravitation argument. And then we look at power asymmetry, which reflects the discrimination argument. So the idea is that if two countries are very unequal, we should see fewer disputes. And if power asymmetry is low, if countries are about equal, we see more disputes. So the idea is that if countries are unequal, the powerful country is going to force the less powerful country to change its behavior if it's violating. Or if the powerful country is violating the rules, it will say, well, I don't care what you mean. And if you go to the WTO, I'm going to retaliate, right? So a power asymmetry should, if power asymmetry has an effect, that means that there is some discrimination. And what we find is that most variation in the participation in the WTO dispute settlement body is simply due to country size and trade. So a lot of this can simply be explained by the amount of trade that we see between two countries. But there's some effect of some evidence for discrimination. So what we find is that the probability, so this is the probability of a dispute, which is greater than 20% in a country dyad, if power asymmetry is low. So that means that if countries are about equal, they have a high propensity to see a dispute. And if power asymmetry increases, which means if countries are unequal, the risk of a dispute decreases. That's what this curve tells you. It decreases below 10%. That means that highly unequal countries, they very rarely see a trade dispute, because the powerful country can actually coerce the other country to either change behavior outside the WTO or not to force it not to use this dispute settlement mechanism against against itself. So bottom line here is that the dispute settlement body actually works fairly well in many cases. It helps to clarify rules when the rules are really complex. It helps when the countries are about equally powerful. So the US and the EU and Japan, they don't have a problem to use it against each other. And there it actually helps to impose pressure on the other to comply with the rules. It is a bit problematic when it comes to unequal country pairs, because here power still plays a role. Any questions about this? Good. Yes. Yes, but if you add Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad together, they're still very small. Right? That's a yes, so, and that's why they are, to some extent, they are hiding in the back of Brazil. So there is an hegemonic argument here. So the idea is that there can be a big country that's also affected, and then the big country takes the lead, like Brazil, and the others hope that this leads to a policy change. And actually, it does lead to a policy change. The US is gradually changing its policy towards everybody else. And but it's much, and they would not have done that without the dispute. So there's a long-term potential side effect for the smaller countries. Or they act together. That's what we often see as well. For instance, in the bananas case, the dispute was initiated by the United States, but there were other complainants like Ecuador and Peru and so on. They joined the dispute. So again, we see that smaller countries can benefit. Can we just wait for 2 more minutes until we're done? So other countries can actually benefit from this if there's a bigger country that takes the lead. That's totally true. So to conclude, what we've done is we looked at the trading system on the international level. So in our analytical framework, we now have a pretty good sense what the problem is and what the interactions are on the international level and how the system works. Now if we go all the way back to the lecture today, at the beginning of the lecture, we talked about these preference functions, right? We just made them up ad hoc. We didn't actually specify in detail or use any theory that motivates this rank order, right? So to do that, to define the national interest in trade politics, what we need to do is we need to go into the country and look at trade preferences of different groups, of the winners and the losers, and how they try to influence trade politics, right? And so we're moving to the micro level within the countries to motivate this. That's what we're going to do next week. Next week we're going to talk about domestic trade politics, so we're moving on the other level of our analytical framework. Good. So see you then next week.